Hey kid, and welcome to an amazing true life kid time story time. My dear Corny the Unicorn. Yes! You see the title of this book? American Slave, American Hero. Oh, how could a slave be a hero? Because I believe that the circumstances of your birth have nothing to do with the future that you set out for yourself. Oh, so just because he was a slave and he was owned by someone? That's right. And he didn't really have his own rights? That's right. The slave does not have any rights. That even though all those things happened to him, he could still be brave and a hero and nothing could stop that? Exactly. Wow! That's even cooler than being a hero with all your rights. Oh, how do you figure that, Corny? Because it's even harder to be a hero when your hands are tied, aren't they? Oh, you are very right. Very deep indeed. Want to know more about this fella? Yes! I clear my throat in preparation. His name is York, of the Lewis and Clark expedition, that famous expedition of Lewis and Clark where they followed the Missouri River and collected plants and staked out the territory for the United States. It was the first time we had gone out west and were negotiating with native tribes. It was a big deal. And York was part of that. But first we begin at the beginning. In the 1770s, two boys were born on a Virginia plantation. One became a famous explorer and leader whose name is still celebrated to this day. The other is also considered a national hero, and yet very few know his name, York. Little is known about sometimes in his life, so you will find the word probably used occasionally in this true story of York, because sometimes the author has to fill in the blanks. Long ago, when the United States was a very young nation, a woman who was probably named Rose gave birth to a baby boy. He was named York. The baby and his parents were slaves. Now, no one knows when York was born because they didn't keep records back then for those kinds of things for slaves. York and his parents were owned by the John Clark family of Virginia, and the Clarks had 6 sons and 4 daughters and about 20 slaves, and they lived on a plantation where they grew, let's see right there, you see the slaves working, tobacco and vegetables. Now, York was a few years younger than William. He was the youngest Clark boy. As the boys grew up, they were probably playmates. Together, they explored the Virginia woods and fished at streams. They learned to ride horses and to swim. And York must have been a good, trustworthy companion, strong and smart, because at about age 12, he was chosen to be William Clark's personal servant. And yes, that is the Clark of Lewis and Clark. And he's only 12 years old. And he's now been made to be the personal servant of his friend. Now, instead of working long hours in the field each day, this meant that York tended to the needs of William Clark. He slept inside the same house. He ate better food and wore better clothes and shoes than the slaves who had to work out in the fields. That's why you sometimes hear people talk about house slaves versus field slaves, because the house slaves, they knew that they were going to have a more comfortable life. However, a slave is a slave, and he was still a slave, and William Clark, this kid right here, not much older than him, was his master. Can you imagine another kid telling you what to do all the time? Now, Clark later wrote of him as my black man York. Now, York could not read those words because teaching a slave to read or write was forbidden by law in Virginia and in lots of other states. About the time that York became William Clark's personal servant, John Clark, that's the daddy, bought a large tract of land in Kentucky, in the fertile Ohio River Valley. The Clark family and their slaves settled there in 1785. Now, 1785, that's a very young nation at the time. Everyone, black and white, worked at clearing fields, planting the first crops, building a house, barn, and fence, and cabins for the slaves. The new Clark home, called Mulberry Hill, was on the western frontier of the young United States. People who settled there were sometimes attacked by Indians, and part of York's job was to protect the family. So he probably learned to use a rifle. You see him right there, practicing to become a good shot. And in more settled areas, however, slaves were not allowed to use firearms. They didn't want them to have weapons with which to rise up. But that's in more settled areas. Out here, everybody needed to be able to defend themselves and be a good shot. At age 19, William left home to serve in the military and became a lieutenant in the U.S. Army. During the 7 years William was away, York probably served as a house slave at Mulberry Hill. In a 1795 letter, William Clark wrote that York had visited his army camp. Perhaps he brought the master some supplies from home. Later in 1795, William Clark returned home to run the family farm at Mulberry Hill, and York was once again his personal slave. In the years that followed, Clark sometimes traveled on family business to New Orleans, New York, Washington, and it's probably assumed that York, his man, would always be by his side. Now, at the turn of the century in 1800, Clark had his 30th birthday. York was in his late 20s, and he was tall and he was powerful, and he was in love with a slave girl from a nearby farm. Now, their masters gave them permission to marry, and a marriage between slaves was a simple ceremony usually conducted by the master of the house or the plantation. Now, they didn't keep public records of these slave marriages, just like the birth records either, so historians have no information about his wife's name, when they were married, or whether they even had any kids. Again, no records. Fast forward a few years, in July 1803, William Clark receives a letter from Meriwether Lewis. Now we're getting it, right? Lewis and Clark. All right. So they'd become friends while they were both in the army. And the letter told of Thomas Jefferson's plan to explore the unmapped West. Because right now, we all know what the West looks like. It's out there, California, Nevada. But back then, it was blank. It was a blank page. Nobody knew what it was like out there. And Thomas Jefferson had a plan to explore this area that was unknown, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, sea to shining sea, right? Well, Lewis asked Clark to help him lead this extraordinary expedition, and Clark eagerly accepted and wrote, "My friend, I join you with hand and heart." While Lewis prepared for the expedition, Clark began to seek the kinds of men that they would need for this wilderness adventure. I mean, two guys out in the wilderness all alone, that's not going to work. They need extra help. Even though Lewis and Clark are the only two you ever hear about, there was a team that went along on this thing. I think it was a total of 33 people. It was going to be hard work. Now, the two guys agreed that the men should be young, healthy, hardworking, and with experience living and hunting in the rugged outdoors. Lewis and Clark tried to choose the best men from the many who volunteered. Now, as a slave, York could not volunteer or refuse to go on the expedition. Whether he went was completely up to his master. But William Clark had no doubts. He had relied on York for years, and he wanted him at his side. The Lewis and Clark expedition, called the Corps of Discovery, that's the official name, but we all call it the Lewis and Clark expedition, set out on May 14th, 1804 by boat up the Missouri River. York was one of about 4 dozen men who rowed the Corps' large keelboat and 2 smaller flat-bottomed pirogues. I think that's how you pronounce it, pirogues? Pirogues? Pirogues you eat. Maybe that's just pirogues. The boats were heavily loaded with food, clothing, tools, weapons, gunpowder, lead for bullets. You never know, you have to shoot your food out there too, right? The cargo also included bundles of beads, scissors, combs, knives, and other items that the men here could use in trade with the natives. The Missouri was wide and swift and dangerous, and the boatmen had to avoid branches and sometimes whole uprooted trees swept downstream by the current. At times, York and the other men struggled to free a boat that got stuck in a sandbar. Every day, they labored for hours using oars and long poles and tow ropes to advance about 10 miles upstream. 10 miles a day. That's slow. Each morning, some of the men set out on foot with their rifles to hunt for meat. Meriwether Lewis often explored alone with his Newfoundland dog, Seaman. He collected leaves of plants and made observations about the land and its wildlife. Clark usually stayed on the ship, estimating distances, taking compass readings that would help him draw accurate maps. Lewis and Clark, as well as several other members of the Corps, kept journals, and they wrote many things, from pesky mosquitoes, they wrote about the bison, which is buffalo, and the other animals that they saw for the very first time in their lives. Imagine, they're exploring an area that they've never seen that has animals they've never seen before. So they're writing about them, they're sketching them, they write about the daily events, the dangers, the jobs that they did. In 1804, Clark wrote, "My servant York swam to the sandbar to gather greens for our dinner." The men ate mostly meat, so having watercress or other wild edible leaves with a meal was a treat and good for their health, like a salad. Later in the summer, Sergeant Charles Floyd became terribly ill, complaining of pain in his stomach. And of all the men, Clark wrote, York was especially helpful. York cared for Floyd as well as he could, but none of the medicines that they brought along really helped, and Floyd died on August 20th, 1804, and was buried on a bluff overlooking the Missouri. He would be the only fellow who would die on this daring expedition, which is incredible in and of itself, that only one man died. On some days, the treeless plains were darkened by the herds of bison. Woo! The men hunted them for food and also used the skins to make clothes and warm robes. One day, Sergeant Patrick Gass wrote of bison hunting in his journal. One of our hunters killed one, and Captain Clark's black servant killed two. Ah, that's York again, and he is a good shot. In September, the expedition paused for 3 days near the villages of the Teton Sioux, while Lewis and Clark met with the leaders of this powerful tribe. One of their goals was to learn about Native Americans and to promote friendly relations with them. However, the Teton Sioux were not so friendly. York and the other men kept their rifles ready and barely slept at night. One meeting with the Sioux almost ended in battle. And finally, the expedition just started out again to get far away from the Sioux, and they pulled hard on those oars. Let's not stick around, they said. So now, the following month, they camped near a village of Arikara Indians. Now, they were friendly, and they loved the gifts that Lewis and Clark brought. But you know who fascinated them the most? York. Clark wrote in his journal, "Those Indians were much astonished at my servant. They never saw a black man before. All flocked around him and examined him from top to toe." So he fascinated the men, the women, and the children. He didn't look like any other man they'd ever seen before, so he was quite exotic. As York played with the children, he pretended to be a wild animal that gobbled up people. And Clark wrote in his journal about it that York made himself more terrible than we wished him to do. Terrible. That? Oh, terrible. I see the spelling back then was a little funny. He made himself terrible. And York showed his great strength. To the Arikara Indians, this powerful black-skinned man was, quote, big medicine, which meant something inexplainable and awe-inspiring. It must have been a super cool experience for him to be such a cool, impressive hero for these folks. Now, later that month, the explorers halted for the winter, because now it's October. York and the other men labored for several days, felling trees and building a small fort near the villages of two Indian tribes, the Mandan and the Hidatsa. One Hidatsa chief wet his fingers and expected paint to rub off of York's skin. Once again, York was hailed as big medicine and was admired and honored by the Mandan and Hidatsa people. Look at that. He's even wearing the tribal clothes. They're digging him. One December night, the temperature fell to 45 degrees below zero. What? Even on days when the air warmed to 0 degrees, the men had to hunt because you gotta eat. So, one December, Clark, York, and 14 others killed a deer and 8 bison. That's 8 giant buffalo. York and several of the other men returned with frostbitten feet from the cold. The men often sang and danced after dinner when Pierre Cruzat played his fiddle. There he is, right there playing the fiddle. William Clark had noticed that York was an extraordinary dancer. Hey! Look at all the little factoids that we're picking up from the journal about York. He's a great hunter, he's a great dancer, he's good with kids. So, on New Year's Day, 1805, he told York to dance for an audience of Mandan and Hidatsa. In his journal, Clark wrote that the Indians were amused and astonished that so large a man should be active, because he was physically fit. But they're not used to big guys being so flexible. In early April, the Missouri River was thawed out, no more ice, and the expedition is ready to continue westward. But first, a dozen men headed downstream in the keel boat. The boat carried maps, written reports, animal skins, and other valuable cargo for President Jefferson. York sent a gift of a bison rope to his wife in Kentucky, so they're sending stuff off. The explorers headed upriver in the 2 pirogues and 6 new canoes that they had hewn from tree trunks. Wow, they made 6 new canoes over the winter. That's one way to spend your cold months. The Corps of Discovery now included 2 surprising additions. A teenage girl named Sacagawea and her 2-month-old baby boy. Now, because Sacagawea spoke the Shoshone language, Lewis and Clark hoped that she would be able to help them trade with that tribe for horses, which they would need if they were going to cross the Rocky Mountains. The expedition advanced deeper and deeper into wild, unmapped country. The explorers faced rattlesnakes and grizzly bears. In their daily battle against the Missouri Current, sometimes York and the other men had to jump into the cold water and tow the boats with ropes that they made from elk skin. By mid-June 1805, Lewis heard a mighty roar ahead and soon saw a huge waterfall, because a waterfall can roar more powerfully than a lion. Well, they discovered 5 waterfalls and miles of rapids ahead, and they had to labor for days hauling heavy canoes and cargo for 18 miles around the falls. Their feet were limping, they were sore, they stepped on cactus that pierced their moccasins, which are nice and soft shoes. Oof. Well, at the end of June, a sudden storm caught many of the men out on the treeless plain. Hit by hailstones, some were bruised and bleeding. William Clark, Sacagawea and her baby, and her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, took shelter under a rock ledge in a ravine, and suddenly, whoosh, a torrent of water rushed at them. Clark helped Sacagawea and her baby up the steep side of the ravine above the rising floodwaters. And then York appeared. He'd been hunting when the storm struck and had gone searching for Clark. He was really relieved to find everyone was okay. And Clark later wrote that York was greatly agitated for our welfare. See, these little clues that Clark is leaving for us in his journal tell us about his concern. There's obviously a personal relationship. They've known each other their whole lives. He's a slave, but they've developed a friendship and a relationship, and he wants what's best for the troop to succeed. In mid-August, towering mountains and the threat of winter loomed ahead. Winter again. Lewis hurried forward and finally met the Shoshone, who had the horses the expedition needed. Now remember, Sacagawea is a Shoshone. She's there to help speak the language, right? The Shoshone, however, were eager to head east to hunt bison. Using sign language, Lewis urged the Shoshone chief Kameahawait, I hope I said that right, Kameahawait, to wait for the rest of the explorers. He said that they included a woman from the Shoshone's own tribe, the Sacagawea, a man with red hair, that's Clark, and most remarkably, listen to this, a man who was black and had short curling hair. The Shoshone stayed, and they too found York to be big medicine. Among the Shoshone and some other Western tribes, men who had fought well in battle blackened their faces with charcoal. And since York was all black, he was considered to be a great warrior and more powerful than his white companions. How about that reception? Soon, the expedition had their horses and a Shoshone man to serve as a guide. The explorers struggled through the snowy, rugged Bitterroot Mountains. I bet it was bitter. Hunters returned empty-handed, though, and food supplies. The Corps was eating meager little meals of candles and bear grease. Candles? I don't think they're like candles that you light at home that smell like vanilla. There's some other kind of candle. Candles and bear grease. William Clark and 6 hunters, probably including York, hurried ahead and met Nez Perce Indians, who were digging edible lily roots on a prairie. The Nez Perce befriended the hungry travelers and agreed to care for their horses. They also gave York a special name that meant Black Indian. So you're getting the drift here that everywhere he goes, York is kind of a big deal. On October 7th, the explorers settled into their newly made canoes and set out down the Clearwater River, which looks pretty rough in this drawing. After struggling against river currents for hundreds of miles, York and the other paddlers were now happy to be carried downstream towards their goal, the Pacific Ocean. The explorers rushed down the Clearwater to the Snake River and then into the Columbia, and because York could swim, he was probably chosen to paddle the canoes through the most dangerous rapids, while men who could not swim, they walked along the shore. On November 7th, 1805, the core of discovery, the Lewis and Clark expedition, reached a wide bay just 20 miles from the Pacific Ocean. They'd made it! Everyone was in super high spirits, even though strong winds and crashing waves trapped them on shore for more than a week. But when the weather calmed, they retreated upriver for a bit. Now, on November 24th, Lewis and Clark called for a discussion and a vote on where they would build a fort for the winter. This is taking forever, isn't it? They're fighting against the elements, and they have to stop every winter. Clark tallied the votes in his journal, and York's vote was recorded. So he got to vote before he was free. He got to vote before male slaves could vote. So he had a vote in this. So he was obviously considered at this point an equal man in this effort. So York's vote was recorded more than 60 years before slavery ended in the United States and freed male slaves could vote. Sacagawea's vote was also recorded more than 100 years before women throughout the United States were given the right to vote. The fact that he was a black slave and she was a Native American woman did not matter to the others. Day after day, they had proven their value to the success of this expedition. The majority voted to cross to the southern side of the Columbia and search for a good fort site. They found one and they built it, Fort Clatsop, named for the Indians in that area. They needed York's great strength, of course, to construct the fort, but he injured himself. We learn more about it in the journal entry that Clark wrote on December 28, 1805, that York was very unwell from a violent cold and strain by carrying meat from the woods and lifting the heavy logs on the works. So he had basically overdone it. During the winter by the Pacific, York often went hunting, especially for elk. From elk skins, York and the others were able to make the clothes, many moccasins, which they would need on the journey home. And everyone was really looking forward to the trek because it was raining nearly every day and they wanted to get out. They were getting bitten by fleas in their sleep that got into their blankets and their robes. And Clark wrote of having my blankets searched and the fleas killed every day. And you know who was probably doing the flea hunting? This guy, York. On March 23rd, 1806, they finally decamped and left the dreary climate of Fort Clatsop and began to paddle their canoes up the Columbia River. A month later, the explorers began to trade elk skins and other items for horses and to travel by land. By late May, they had enough horses and were eager to start across the Bitter Roots. Remember those mountains? But the Nez Perce warned them that the mountain trails were still buried under feet of snow. They were going to have to wait, and that was difficult. Partly because they just didn't have enough food. The hunters did their best, and Lewis and Clark continued to trade with the Nez Perce for food, but they had very little left to offer the Indians. But you know what they did have? York, a man greatly respected by the Indians. So twice, York was sent on trading missions. Twice, he returned with a surprising amount of food, because they were probably so captivated by him. Before the second trip, Lewis and Clark cut the brass buttons from their military uniforms. They cut the buttons out, and they used these buttons and a few other small items. And York took them along with a fellow named Hugh McNeil, and they traded those little things for 3 bushels of edible roots and some bread. Oh, well, Lewis and the men were super thrilled at the return of a good cargo. They got a lot of food for buttons. After crossing the mountains, the expedition split into 2 groups, aiming to explore different river valleys. Now Clark's group, which of course included York, canoed down the Yellowstone River until it joined the Missouri. Clark continued to draw maps and to name features of the landscape after members of the expedition, which is nice, right? You have a mountain named after you, a river named after you. He named a river that flowed into the Yellowstone for York. In 1805, he had named a cluster of islands in the Missouri, York's 8 Islands. So how about that? So York got a couple of things named after him. On August 12, 1806, the 2 groups led by Clark and Lewis reunited on the Missouri, and the explorers sped downstream. York continued to help feed everyone. The journal reports that he shot an elk and a bison for food. So he is invaluable. He's helping keep everybody fed on this trip. The explorers had disappeared into the unknown for 28 months. It's more than 2 years. When they met trading boats heading upriver, they learned that nearly everyone thought they were dead. Cheering crowds greeted the explorers when they reached the river town of St. Louis on September 23, 1806. The expedition's return was celebrated at dinner parties, first in St. Louis, later in Washington, and then other cities. Everyone praised Lewis and Clark's leadership, but all members of the Corps of Discovery, including York, were hailed as national heroes. Eventually, the men of the expedition were rewarded with double pay and many acres of land. But because he was a slave, York got nothing. He also had no choice but to settle in St. Louis with William Clark in 1808 when his master began working there for the government. York asked Clark for permission to work back home near his wife. Remember, his wife is back closer to home. Clark refused, but allowed York to visit her for a few weeks. York stayed several months, however, and returned to St. Louis reluctantly. But York's attitude upset Clark, who wrote to his brother, "I gave him a severe trouncing the other day." Clark gave up on York as a personal servant and sent him to work driving a freight wagon for the Clark family in Kentucky. The owner of York's wife moved to Mississippi with his slaves, so York, probably never saw her again. At some point, perhaps as long as 10 years after the expedition's return, Clark finally gave York his freedom. He also gave him a wagon and 6 horses as a start in the freight hauling business. However, it's sad to say, but York's business did not succeed. White farmers and businessmen of those times often did not want to hire freed slaves. Sometime before 1832, York died of the disease cholera. Some historians believe that York was on his way to St. Louis in hopes of rejoining William Clark when he died. Details of his death and his burial are mysteries, as are those of countless other slaves. As we talked about throughout the book, there were no records kept of so many things about their lives. But the journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition reveal some important truths about York. Like the other explorers, York endured extreme heat and cold, suffered injuries and illness, risked his life many times, and contributed to the success of the expedition that is still considered the greatest in U.S. history. He was both a slave and an American hero. And here's a postscript. In 2001, long after his death, York was promoted to the rank of Honorary Sergeant Regular Army by President William Jefferson Clinton. Is that not incredible? I love this story. I had never heard about York. I had only heard about Lewis and Clark. Of course, I'd never heard about anybody on that expedition. There were so many men on that expedition that helped map out the rest of the United States. Wow! But now we know an important member of this important expedition? Exactly. And now you know that even if you're a hero, even if you're a slave, you can be a hero. Because why? Because you said that the circumstances of your birth do not, that's a big word, dictate. Do not dictate your future life. Exactly. Although it makes me kind of sad. Yeah, in what way? Because York, he never got to see his wife again. Yeah, that's very hard. Slaves had to endure a lot back then. And I thought that William Clark would let him go. Well, he did, but it took him 10 years. And in the meantime, he was separated from his wife all that time, although he did sneak away and get that one long visit in. But sounds like he was mad about it. Yeah. Those were very different times, but I'm glad that William Clark did a very good thing in writing about his man York so that the rest of us throughout history will not forget him. Yeah, that was a good story. Thanks, I'm glad you liked it. And thanks, kid, for enjoying this true American story. And I hope that you found it as inspiring as I did. And now you know that whatever obstacles you face in life, you can still be a hero. Exactly. See you next time on